My daughter called me senile in front of 2.3 million people on a rainy Tuesday morning. I remember the exact moment because I was sitting at my kitchen table eating rye toast with apricot preserves and trying to finish the Boston Globe crossword puzzle. Irony, as it turns out, has a mean streak and a cruel sense of humour. The clue across from my thumb was an 8-letter word for betrayal. I never did finish solving it. Right around 8:12 a.m., my phone started vibrating across the Formicite table. Buzz, then a pause, then buzz again. By the 5th consecutive ring, a cold spike of adrenaline hit my chest. When you're 76 years old, consecutive phone calls at dawn usually mean someone is lying in a ditch or a hospital bed. I picked it up. It was Vivian Tull from across Bell Street. "Miriam," she said, her voice dropping into that hushed, careful cadence people usually reserve for approaching wounded animals or standing beside open caskets. "Are you all right, honey?" That rubbed me raw immediately. I was doing just fine, Vivian, until you used that particular voice on me. Who died? There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint click of her coffee mug hitting her counter. "You haven't seen it yet, have you?" "Seen what? Speak English, Vivian." Another pause. "Your daughter, Celia, posted something. Well, she posted a video online." The air in my kitchen suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. I thanked Vivian, hung up, and opened Facebook on my iPad. I went there first because Facebook is where Celia likes to perform her compassion. It's her stage. Birthdays, charity brunches, photos of expensive cheese boards that nobody actually eats. Everything in her life is curated to look like a spread in a New England lifestyle magazine. Her profile picture was still that professionally lit portrait where she tilts her head just enough to look intensely sympathetic, like a saint who specializes in mid-tier real estate. The video she had uploaded was already spreading like wildfire across the internet. The little view counter at the bottom read 2.3 million. The thumbnail alone made my stomach do a slow, sick flip. It was a candid shot of me carrying 2 brown paper grocery bags outside the Juniper House, my old brick apartment building. I was wearing my beige raincoat, the ugly, oversized one with the torn inner pocket that Arthur always told me to throw out. My shoulders looked smaller than I felt they were, older, fragile, almost sunken. Celia had added a soft, weeping piano track over the top of the footage. The caption underneath read, "My beautiful mother has been struggling with severe cognitive decline lately. She's far too proud to admit she needs help. Yesterday, I found her wandering the streets of Portland, begging strangers for grocery money because she forgot she had access to her own bank accounts. Please be kind. Elder mental health matters. Hashtag dementia awareness. Hashtag love your parents." And right beneath that touching little paragraph was a blue link, a donation page, a digital tin cup set out for my benefit. I sat there staring at the screen so long my tea developed a skin on top. The comment section was a feeding trough of performance art. Your poor mother. You are such an angel for carrying this burden, Celia. This breaks my heart. Can someone report this to Adult Protective Services so she gets the care she deserves? My grandmother acted exactly like this right before she forgot my name. Forgot her name. I can still recite my 6th grade teacher's home phone number from 1961. I can tell you the exact date the Red Sox broke the curse, and I can tell you the property tax rate on every square inch of Bell Street.
I clicked play. The video opened with Celia whispering dramatically into her phone camera while standing outside the Juniper House lobby. I didn't know whether to post this, she said, her eyes already glistening with tears she'd probably practiced in her rearview mirror. But people need to understand how quickly dementia can steal the people we love. Then the video cut to footage of me standing outside Duca's Market down the street. I remembered that exact moment from Monday afternoon perfectly. I hadn't been begging a single soul for change. I had dropped my leather wallet between the front seats of my Buick, and because my knees don't bend the way they did during the Kennedy administration, I didn't feel like crawling around under the steering wheel in the pouring rain. So I asked Otto Bramley, one of my third-floor tenants who happened to be walking by, if I could borrow $3 for a pint of half and half. Otto laughed, called me a stubborn old mule, and handed me a $5. By dinner time, I'd already walked up to his apartment and paid him back with a fresh plate of cannoli. But in Celia's video, the footage was edited, snipped. She'd zoomed in right when I was squinting at my handwritten shopping list, making me look utterly bewildered. She doesn't even recognize familiar places anymore, Celia narrated in a soft, tragic voiceover. That part almost impressed me with its sheer, unadulterated cruelty. Duca's Market was a store I'd been shopping at before Celia lost her baby teeth. My hands started to shake, not from age, mind you, but from a hot, blinding rage that made my ears ring. Then the phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed my bank. I picked it up, my voice tight. "Hello?" "Mrs. Alden," a young man said, sounding incredibly nervous. "This is Tyler from Northeast Security Bank. We've received some urgent concerns this morning regarding potential financial vulnerability on your accounts." "I am about as vulnerable as a cornered badger, Tyler. What are you talking about?" "Of course, ma'am, but due to a formal report filed by an immediate family member and the supporting evidence provided online, we have placed a temporary protective freeze on your secondary checking account pending an internal review for your own protection." A report? My daughter filed a report against me? I stood up so abruptly, my kitchen chair scraped against the linoleum tile with a sharp shriek, startling my tabby cat Barnaby, who was sleeping near the radiator. I walked over to the window. Outside, Portland Harbor was completely swallowed by a heavy gray Atlantic fog. Somewhere down the pier, a gull was screaming over the morning catch at the fish market. Ordinary sounds, an ordinary Maine morning, except the entire world had just tilted half an inch sideways. The worst part wasn't the public humiliation. It was the sudden freezing realization that lies like this don't just materialize out of thin air. They are drafted, they are edited, they are timed. My daughter had timed this beautifully. I sat back down, forced myself to breathe through my nose, and replayed the video from the beginning. This time, I didn't look at it as a mother. I looked at it the way my late husband Arthur used to look at a leaky pipe under a tenant's sink, looking for the source of the rot. I noticed the details, the angles, the edits. Some of these clips were weeks old. One snippet showed me fumbling with the front door keys during the nor'easter back in February, entirely omitting the fact that the brass lock had frozen solid in 20-degree weather. She had been quietly collecting footage of me for months. Then I saw it. In the background of one clip, barely visible on my kitchen counter behind Celia's shoulder, sat a dark blue cardstock folder with a gold plastic tab. I recognized that folder instantly. It belonged to Brock's estate planning firm. A cold, heavy stone settled into the bottom of my chest. This wasn't a daughter having a breakdown over her mother's aging. This was a legal ambush. This was preparation. By noon, the neighborhood had turned me into a charity case. 3 different people called to ask if I needed my groceries delivered. A woman I barely recognized from the Presbyterian church left a canvas tote bag on my front porch filled with canned chicken noodle soup, saltines, chamomile tea, and a plastic jar of brain support gummies that tasted like lavender-flavored chalk. Another neighbor, bless her heart, slipped a $20 bill into my mailbox wrapped inside a sympathy card. The front of the card had a painting of a lonely lighthouse on it, and the inside read, "You are not alone, Miriam. We love you." I stood out on my porch in the damp air, holding that $20 bill, while the rain dripped from the green canvas awning onto the toes of my Keds. For the first time in 10 years, I genuinely didn't know whether to burst into tears or throw a brick through a window. I chose neither. Instead, I went back inside, brewed a pot of black coffee strong enough to strip the varnish off a deck, and sat back down at the table. The comments on Celia's video had doubled. She was replying to people now, of course, always gracious, always the long-suffering, dignified daughter. "Thank you all for the prayers," she wrote to some stranger from Ohio. "It has been absolutely heartbreaking to watch her slip away, but we are doing everything we can to get her the proper professional oversight she needs." We. Now there was an interesting choice of words, because in Celia's vocabulary, we usually meant her and her husband, Brock Rains, and whenever Brock's name entered a conversation, you could bet your last dollar that a financial ledger wasn't far behind. I should tell you a little something about my daughter. Celia had perfected the high society art of looking like a humanitarian while calculating the square footage of a room in her head. At 48, she was elegant in that expensive, brittle way that women in certain zip codes tend to be. Cream-colored wool coats, pristine white teeth, hair appointments in Boston that cost more than my first 3 mortgage payments combined. Even her grief looked curated. When she hugged people at funerals, she always managed to turn her good side toward the room. Arthur saw right through her years before I did. I remember him sitting on an upturned milk crate in the basement of the Juniper house, grease on his knuckles, fixing a copper pipe while the old boiler groaned in the corner. "Miriam," he'd said, wiping his hands on a rag, "our girl isn't cruel, not deep down, but she's becoming the kind of person who thinks how things look matters more than what things are. That's a dangerous way to live." I defended her back then. Mothers are foolish like that. I told her she was just ambitious, that the world was different for young women now. The truth is, Celia wasn't always a stranger. When she was a little girl, she used to sit on the concrete floor of the Juniper House laundry room, swinging her legs and reading Nancy Drew novels while I folded the tenants' bed sheets. She loved orange creamsicles from the corner truck and old Fred Astaire movies.
When she was 10, she cried for 48 hours straight because Mrs. Gable in apartment 2A moved to New Jersey. She had a heart. But somewhere between her acceptance letter to Wellesley and her second country club membership, an embarrassment crept into her bloodstream like black mold inside drywall. Suddenly, the Juniper House wasn't a proud historic building. It was run down. My cooking smelled too heavy. The tenants I loved, the dock workers, the young nurses, the retired teachers, became those renters, and me, I became someone who was mostly useful when a signature was required. The first time Brock asked about the building's market value was during Thanksgiving dinner 7 years ago. I remember it vividly because he asked it while spooning bourbon-glazed sweet potatoes onto his plate, his voice completely casual, like he was asking about the morning traffic. "You ever think about selling the Juniper House, Miriam?" he asked, flashing that blinding salesman smile. "No," I said, without looking up from my turkey. "Arthur and I bought that building in 1974. It stayed where we put it, and so will I." "Properties that old become liabilities," Brock said, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "The maintenance alone must be eating you alive." "So do some relatives, Brock, but we keep them around anyway," Arthur muttered from the head of the table. Arthur nearly choked trying not to laugh, and Brock's smile flattened to a hard, straight line for half a second. It was a tiny thing, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, but I was looking. After Arthur's heart attack 4 years ago, the questions from Celia and Brock started with a regular rhythmic frequency, like waves hitting the pier. "Have you updated your estate plan, Mom? Who handles your tenant ledgers now that Dad's gone? What happens if you take a spill down those front stairs? What if someone takes advantage of you, Miriam?" That last one always wanted to make me laugh out loud. Someone taking advantage of me. Meanwhile, Brock had spent the better part of 2024 trying to convince me to invest my savings into a luxury pickleball complex outside Portsmouth. I told him I'd rather throw my money directly into the Piscataqua River. At least the splashing would be entertaining. Then came the blue folder. 3 weeks before the video appeared on Facebook, Celia and Brock came over to my place on a soggy Sunday afternoon. Brock brought a box of overpriced pastries from some boutique Scandinavian bakery where a single cardamom bun cost $9. Celia spent the first 20 minutes wandering around my kitchen using a linen napkin to wipe imaginary dust off my porcelain teapot. At one point, Brock casually set that dark blue folder on the kitchen table right next to my coffee mug. "Just some routine emergency planning documents, Miriam," he said, his voice dropping into that unnaturally smooth, polished marble tone he uses when he's trying to close a deal. "Sounds romantic," I said, looking at the gold tab. Celia gave me that long-suffering, exhausted daughter smile she'd been practicing. "Mom, please, don't make everything into a federal case. We're just looking out for you." I didn't say a word. I opened the folder. Inside were standard Maine legal forms, but the headers didn't say emergency planning. They said petition for limited conservatorship. It wasn't a request for full control, not yet. It was a foot in the door. It was a legal mechanism that would give Celia the right to oversee my real estate holdings and financial transactions if a physician deemed me incapable. I felt a strange, cold sensation pass through my limbs. It wasn't fear, it wasn't shock. It was the quiet satisfaction of a woman who finally sees the exact shape of the monster lurking under the water. "We just want to ensure that some predatory developer doesn't come along and take advantage of your situation," Brock continued, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. Predatory developers. I looked at him and had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from asking if he'd looked in a mirror lately, but I kept my mouth shut. That's the fundamental mistake people make about older women. They assume that because you're quiet, you're compliant. They think silence is a white flag. They don't realize that sometimes silence is just reconnaissance. I flipped through the pages slowly, my eyes stopping on a specific addendum, property disposition review. The Juniper House was listed explicitly by name and parcel number. I looked up at Brock, my face completely expressionless. "You've been very busy, haven't you?" He smiled too quickly, his fingers tapping against his knee. "Just being proactive, Miriam, that's all." I closed the folder gently, set it aside, and poured them both more coffee in my good porcelain cups. I sat there for another hour, smiling politely while my daughter explained to me, the woman who had balanced the books and managed tenant relations since the Reagan administration, why I might someday become too confused to understand a bank statement. I smiled through the entire conversation, and that, more than anything, was what terrified them, because what they didn't know, what they could possibly not have guessed, is that the Juniper House was already quietly receiving offers.
The first serious inquiry for the Juniper House had arrived 6 months before my daughter decided to turn me into internet hospice content. Ironically, Celia almost spilled a glass of Pinot Noir all over the paperwork the night it came in. We'd been having dinner at her place, one of those modern grey homes where every single surface looks incredibly expensive and deeply uncomfortable to sit on. Nothing in that house ever smelled like food. It smelled like scented candles, eucalyptus diffusers, and polished quartz. Brock was outside on the deck, grilling salmon while shouting market analytics into his wireless headset. Celia was busy arranging green olives on a marble tray for an Instagram photo. I had brought a homemade blackberry galette, a dessert Arthur used to love, but nobody touched it. It sat on the counter looking like a relic from a different civilization. Halfway through the salad course, my phone buzzed with an email from a woman named Priya Sandoval. The subject line read, "Inquiry regarding historic multi-family property, 42 Bell Street." Brock's eyes zipped straight to my screen. "What's that, Miriam? You still running business from the dinner table?" He chuckled, though his eyes remained flat. "You still calling that old place a business?" "Yes, Brock," I said, putting my reading glasses on. "That is generally what people call a building that generates 12 rent checks a month." Celia laughed a little too loudly at that, shifting the conversation back to their upcoming trip to Napa Valley and a woman named Trish who had just spent $12,000 on a backyard koi pond for her emotional alignment. I ignored them and read the email. Priya Sandoval wasn't a corporate shark representing a firm with a name like Apex Living LLC. She didn't use words like synergy or disrupting the market. She was the director of a historic preservation housing trust based out of Boston. Her letter was detailed, respectful, and remarkably well researched. She knew the Juniper House was built in 1911. She knew it had the original heart pine flooring under the old carpets, and she knew it was one of the last remaining examples of working-class brick architecture on Bell Street that hadn't been gutted into luxury lofts. Most importantly, she wrote, "Our trust specializes in maintaining the historic integrity of these properties while preserving long-term lease agreements for low-income tenants." I didn't reply that night. I tucked the email away in the back of my mind. But after the bank called to freeze my account on Tuesday morning, that email became my North Star. Because the moment your own flesh and blood publicly questions your mental fitness, your entire life becomes an open target.
Brock's little blue folder wasn't a hypothetical threat anymore. It was a loaded gun on the table. At 1 o'clock that afternoon, I got into my Buick and drove straight down to Bell Street. The rain was slicking the asphalt into a mirror-gray sheen. Portland looked washed out, cold, and beautifully stubborn under the Atlantic fog. My windshield wipers were squeaking rhythmically, screech, thwack, screech, thwack, because I kept forgetting to buy the refills at the auto shop. A normal person would call that forgetfulness. Celia would probably call it stage 3 neurological decay. I pulled up to the curb. The Juniper House stood exactly where Arthur and I had found it 50 years ago, looking like an old heavyweight boxer who refused to hit the canvas. The red brick had turned dark and deep from the rain. The green canvas awnings over the front windows were frayed at the corners, and there were tiny chips in the granite steps, chips Arthur had always promised he'd repair himself before his knees gave out. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, the engine idling warmly against my shins. For the first time in my life, I felt a heavy, suffocating dread about walking into my own lobby. What if they'd seen it? What if my tenants, the people I'd shared coffee and gossip with for decades, looked at me and saw a broken mind? By noon, half the city had probably seen that video. I took a deep breath, gathered my raincoat tightly around my neck, and pushed open the car door. When I stepped into the lobby, the familiar smell wrapped around me like an old wool blanket. It smelled of steam radiator heat, cedar floor polish, and garlic. It was Thursday, which meant Mr. Lazaro in apartment 3B was cooking his family traditional puttanesca sauce like clockwork. Otto Bramley was standing near the wall, holding a plastic watering can and tending to the pots of basil we kept on the wide windowsill by the mailboxes. Otto is 79, wears plaid suspenders 12 months a year, and smells permanently of Prince Albert pipe tobacco, despite the fact that his doctor forced him to quit smoking in 1998. He looked up when the heavy oak door clicked shut. For one horrible, agonizing second, I saw his expression tighten. It wasn't judgment, it was pity. And let me tell you, pity from an old friend is a far heavier thing to carry than anger. "Miriam," he said, his voice dropping into that quiet, careful register. "Oh, don't you start with that voice too, Otto Bramley," I snapped, shaking the rain off my umbrella. "I've had quite enough of it today." Otto's face broke into a wide, craggy grin, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He lowered the watering can on the mosaic floor. "Well, thank God for that. I told Vivian you'd be spitting nails by lunchtime. I am furious, which my doctor tells me is excellent for my overall circulation." He let out a short bark of a laugh. I needed that sound. I needed a normal, irreverent laugh more than I needed air. "You know nobody in this building believes a single word of that internet garbage, right?" Otto said, his smile fading into something serious and protective. "You'd be amazed what people are willing to believe when a pretty woman cries on a smartphone screen, Otto." He muttered something in Italian that was definitely not approved by the Catholic Church. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of printer paper. "Some kid from down the block taped these up next to the front door around 9 this morning," Otto said, handing it over. "Screenshots of the video comments. I ripped them down before the afternoon mail delivery came through." I unfolded the paper. Someone had used a blue ballpoint pen to circle one specific comment left by a user named Coastal Living 99. Her family needs to step in and put her in a managed care facility before she signs away something dangerous. She clearly doesn't have capacity. I stared at that word, capacity, for a long, quiet minute. There it was, the real prize. It wasn't about my safety. It wasn't about whether I forgot my raincoat or dropped my wallet. It was about my signature. They wanted to erase my right to sign my own name. Otto watched my face closely, his arms crossed over his chest. "You know this is all about the Juniper House, Miriam." "I know it is," I said, folding the paper back up and sliding it into my pocket. "Are you going to sell it to them?" "No," I said, looking at the crooked brass mailboxes on the wall. "But I might sell it to someone else." Otto nodded slowly, showing no surprise at all. He reached out and patted my shoulder with a hand that was rough from 40 years of shipyard work. "You know, Arthur told me once, right before he went into the hospital, he said if the world ever went to hell, you'd be the last one standing because you can outlast just about anybody." That nearly did me in. Not because it was sad, but because Arthur had been dead right. I walked to the elevator, the old Otis model with the black Bakelite button that only registers if you press it with absolute conviction. I pushed it, rode it up to the 4th floor, listening to the steel cables groan and complain between floors 2 and 3, the way they always do. Apartment 4C had been vacant for 3 weeks. The previous tenant, a young law student named Clara, had graduated and moved down to Boston. I still carried the master key ring in my purse. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The rooms were empty, clean, and filled with that grey, diffused light that comes off the Atlantic during a storm. If you leaned your forehead right against the glass...
Jonas Kettering had been my attorney for nearly 2 decades. In 20 years of property law, he had helped me navigate 3 plumbing lawsuits, 1 spectacular tenant divorce that somehow became my problem, and an unforgettable incident in 1994 where a man tried to pay 6 months of back rent using a collection of mint-condition porcelain ferret figurines. He was a dry, pragmatic Yankee with a voice that sounded like gravel shifting under a boot. He didn't panic, and he didn't sugarcoat. "Miriam," Jonas said, the sound of his keyboard clicking through the line, "this isn't a cage, this is a paper war. What exactly has she done besides the video?" I laid out the pieces for him, my voice steady, counting them off on my fingers. "She's got a donation page up that's cleared several $1,000s by now. She filed a vulnerability report with Northeast Security Bank this morning, and they've already frozen my secondary checking account. And 3 weeks ago, Brock brought a blue folder to my kitchen containing a petition for a limited conservatorship." The clicking on the other end of the line stopped instantly. The silence stretched out long enough that I could hear the rain tapping against the empty glass panes of apartment 4C. "Did you sign anything in that folder, Miriam? Anything at all? Even a receipt for the pastries?" "I might be 76, Jonas, but I am not suicidal. I didn't sign a thing." "Good, thank God." Jonas took a long, slow breath. "Here is what you need to understand, because most folks don't get it until the water's already up their chin. You do not need a judge to formally declare you incompetent for your life to start falling apart. All it takes is the suspicion of it." "Explain that to me."
It's about risk, Jonas said. You have a concerned relative making noise, you have a highly visible public narrative, you have a report filed with a bank. Suddenly, institutions become cautious. A cautious bank slows down your transactions. A cautious title company refuses to clear a deed because they're terrified of a future lawsuit from your heirs. A cautious doctor writes a phrase like possible early cognitive transition in your file just to cover his own backside during a routine checkup. Before you even get a court date, your access to your own life gets throttled. And if you have valuable real estate involved, that's exactly how they trap you. I looked out toward the harbor. A container ship was creeping through the channel, its foghorn blowing a low, vibrating note that shook the glass in the frame. "They want to stop me from doing anything with the Juniper House," I stated. "Exactly," Jonas said. "Brock knows the market. If they can freeze you in place with a temporary injunction or a pending evaluation, they can control the narrative until you're tired enough to just hand over the keys. Now tell me about the interest on the building. You mentioned an email last week." Priya Sandoval, Boston Historic Preservation Housing Trust. They sent a preliminary estimate of $3.45 million, Jonas, with a guarantee to protect the tenants' current lease structures for the next 10 years. I could hear Jonas let out a low whistle. "That is a magnificent number, Miriam, and it explains why Brock is sweating through his custom suits. A week before the video went up, he told me the building was a liability and worth $1.8 million at best. He was trying to undervalue your asset so that when they took over the conservatorship, selling it off would look like a routine liquidation rather than a multi-million-dollar heist," Jonas said, his gravelly voice hardening. "It's an old play. It's dirty, but it works. So how do we stop the play?" "We don't just stop it, Miriam. We run right through it. But you're going to have to do some things that will make you uncomfortable. I am currently watching my daughter weep on the internet because I bought a pint of cream, Jonas. My comfort level left the building hours ago." "All right," Jonas said. "Step 1, I'm booking you an independent, comprehensive cognitive and neurological evaluation for Thursday morning. We're not waiting for a court to order one. We're going to a specialist who has absolutely no connection to your family or your medical history, Dr. Elena Merker over at Maine Medical Center. She's a straight shooter. You're going to sit in her office, you're going to answer her puzzles, and we are going to get a certified, unassailable document stating your brain is as sharp as a meat cleaver." "A memory test," I muttered, my pride stinging. "At my age, you have to prove you aren't an idiot just because your daughter tells lies on Facebook." "At your age," Jonas corrected gently, "you document your strength before someone else weaponizes your silence. Step 2, I want screenshots of every single post, every comment, and every dollar raised on that donation page. We're building a counterfile for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress." "And step 3?" I asked. "Step 3 is the hammer," Jonas said. "We contact Priya Sandoval this afternoon. We skip the back and forth. We tell her if her trust can have the closing paperwork prepped and ready by Friday morning, the Juniper House is theirs for $3.45 million. We sell the building out from under Brock's nose while he's still waiting for his Facebook likes to clear." I sat there in the empty apartment, the smell of Mr. Lazzaro's garlic sauce drifting faintly through the floorboards. The hardwood floor creaked under my shoes as I stood up.
This building had been my anchor for 50 years. Every creak, every leaky pipe, every Christmas ribbon I'd tied around the lobby banister with my own hands because nobody else could ever get the loops perfectly symmetrical. Selling it felt like tearing out a piece of my own ribs. But as I looked down at the paper Otto had given me, at that circled comment telling the world to lock me away for my own good, I knew that keeping the bricks didn't matter if I lost my name. Do it, Jonas. Call the woman in Boston.
When I came back down to the lobby, the rain had settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the street lamps. Otto was still sitting by the windows, though he'd traded his watering can for a copy of the Portland Press Herald. He didn't look up immediately when the elevator door groaned open, but as I walked past his chair, he lowered the paper just an inch. "Well," he said, squinting through his reading glasses, "look at that." "Look at what, Otto?" "You've got your war face on." I paused, my hand on the heavy brass handle of the front door. "My what?" "Your war face," he repeated, folding the newspaper over his knee. "The exact face you had back in October of '96 when that insurance company tried to tell Arthur that the basement flooding wasn't covered because it was surface water instead of rising water. You spent 3 days in their corporate office downtown eating their complimentary mints and refusing to leave until the vice president signed a check." I blinked, a sudden warm memory breaking through the gray fog of my afternoon. I had forgotten about that. Arthur had been so stressed his shingles had flared up, and I'd simply gone down to the insurance office with a thermos of black coffee and a ledger. "I suppose I did," I said, a small smile finally tugging at the corner of my mouth. "That face usually means somebody's about to regret their entire week," Otto said, returning to his crossword. "Good luck, Miriam." "Thank you, Otto. Keep an eye on the basil." The next 48 hours moved with a terrifying mechanical speed. Thursday morning found me sitting in a windowless examination room at Maine Medical Center, staring across a laminated table at Dr. Elena Mercer. She was a woman in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent gray eyes, a cropped haircut, and a no-nonsense manner that immediately made me respect her. She didn't treat me like an old lady. She didn't use that soft, patronizing voice that had been chasing me down the street all week. She handed me a pen and a series of papers. For 2 straight hours I was put through the paces. I drew clocks showing specific times. I recorded lists of random words 5 minutes after she'd slipped them into conversation. I counted backward from 100 by sevens. Let me tell you, counting backward from 100 by sevens at 9 a.m. while your entire financial future hangs in the balance is enough to make a woman sweat. 93, 86, 79, 72, 65. When I finished the last sequence, Dr. Mercer laid her pen down on my file, looked at me over her glasses, and let out a dry, appreciative snort. "Mrs. Alden," she said, "your short-term recall is in the 98th percentile for adults of any age. Your spatial reasoning is flawless, and your executive function is sharper than that of most of my medical residents who live on energy drinks." "So I'm not losing my marbles, Doctor?" "If you are, I'd like to know where you're keeping them so I can buy a jar for myself," she said, pulling a sheet of heavy letterhead toward her and beginning to write.
I am signing off on a certified comprehensive evaluation confirming zero evidence of cognitive impairment, dementia, or functional decline. You have full legal and medical capacity." I took that piece of paper from her hand while the ink was still damp. It felt heavier than gold. By Friday morning, Jonas Kettering's office looked like a war room. Priya Sandival had caught the 5:30 train up from Boston. She was sitting on Jonas's leather sofa, wearing a sharp navy blazer, her laptop open on her knees. She didn't look like a shark. She looked like a woman who genuinely loved old brickwork and respected the people who lived inside it. "We verified the escrow funds, Mrs. Alden," Priya said, showing me the digital transfer layout. 3.45 million, fully cleared. The covenants are drafted into the deed. The Juniper House cannot be demolished, modified externally, or cleared of its current tenants for a minimum of 10 years. Mr. Bramley, Mr. Lazaro, and the others are secure. I looked at Jonas. He gave me a single, firm nod. I picked up the heavy plastic pen. My hand didn't shake, not even a little. I transferred the deed of the Juniper House to the Preservation Trust. The transaction time stamped on the digital receipt was 11:42 a.m. "Now," Jonas said, reaching into a manila folder on his desk and pulling out a fresh set of documents with a feral little smile, "let's deal with the family."
Celia called me at exactly 11:15 a.m. while I was sitting in the passenger seat of Jonas's Buick, driving back toward Bell Street. Her voice through the Bluetooth speaker was a masterclass in synthetic grief. "Mom, oh, thank goodness you picked up. I've been calling your house phone for hours. Brock and I have been sick with worry." "I was out running errands, Celia." "Mom, honey, we talked about this," she said, her tone dropping into that dripping saccharine sweetness that made my teeth ache. "You shouldn't be out driving in this weather by yourself. It's not safe. Look, Brock and I are actually over at your house right now. We brought some lunch from that nice cafe you like, and we have some papers we really need to sit down and go over together for your peace of mind." I looked out the window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the Portland streets gleaming like wet slate under a pale white sun. "How convenient," I said. "I'm just turning onto the block now. Leave the door unlocked." When I walked through my front door, the kitchen looked like a staged open house event. Brock had his leather briefcase open on my counter, a gold cross pen laid perfectly parallel to a stack of legal documents. Celia was standing by the stove, leaning against the counter with a profound, heavy-lidded exhaustion that she usually saved for charity board meetings. "There she is," Brock said, stepping forward with his hand extended, his salesman's smile firmly in place. "Miriam, you gave us a real scare this morning. We were just talking to the bank and—" "I know what you were doing with the bank, Brock," I said, ignoring his hand and walking straight to the head of the table. I took off my raincoat, hung it neatly over the back of the chair, and sat down. "Sit down, both of you." Celia blinked, her sympathetic expression faltering for a fraction of a second. "Mom, what's going on? You seem tense. This is exactly what I was talking about in the video, the sudden mood shifts." "Shut your mouth, Celia," I said, my voice completely flat, level, and ice cold.
The room went dead silent. Brock stopped mid-stride, his briefcase handle still in his hand. Celia's mouth stayed open for a second before her face turned a bright, blotchy red. "Excuse me," she gasped. I reached into my large leather purse, pulled out Dr. Mercer's certified medical evaluation, and slid it across the table until it hit Brock's gold pen with a soft clack. "That is a comprehensive neurological assessment from the Chief of Geriatric Psychiatry at Maine Medical Center, stamped 3 hours ago, and it states that I possess the cognitive capacity of a woman 20 years my junior, and that there is 0 evidence of functional or mental decline. It has already been filed with Northeast Security Bank, and my checking account has been unfrozen." Brock's eyes zipped down to the paper. His face went entirely pale, the skin around his jaw tightening until the muscle jumped. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the signatures at the bottom. "Miriam," he started, his smooth voice cracking just a bit at the edges. This is great news, obviously. We were just concerned because—" "You weren't concerned about a single thing except this," I said, reaching back into my bag and pulling out the certified copy of the sale agreement. I slid it across the table, right on top of his documents. "At 10:42 this morning, I sold the Juniper House to the Boston Historic Preservation Housing Trust for $3.45 million. The funds are currently sitting in a private trust account that neither of you will ever have legal access to." Celia let out a sharp, strangled shriek, her hands flying to her mouth. "You did what? You sold the building for $3 million? Mom, that building has been in our family for 50 years. That was our inheritance." "Inheritance is for the dead, Celia, and as you can see from Dr. Mercer's report, I am remarkably vertical." I leaned forward and rested my forearms on the table. "You wanted to use the internet to turn me into a helpless old woman so you could liquidate my life for $2 million and buy yourself a bigger house in Cape Elizabeth. You thought because I was old I wouldn't notice the angles. You thought because I was quiet I was stupid." "Mom, that video was about raising awareness," Celia cried, her eyes welling up with actual tears this time, tears of sheer, unadulterated panic. "We were trying to protect you from making dangerous decisions. Look what you just did. You sold our asset." "No," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "My daughter died on Facebook last Tuesday morning. The woman standing in my kitchen right now is just a real estate speculator who made a very, very bad investment." I stood up, walked over to the door, and held it wide open. The crisp, salty Maine air swept into the hallway, clearing out the lingering scent of Brock's expensive cologne. "Get out of my house," I said, "both of you. And if I see either of your faces on my porch again without a sheriff present, I'll show you exactly how much energy a 76-year-old woman has left." Brock didn't say a word. He scooped up his briefcase, grabbed Celia by the elbow, and hurried down the hallway, his leather shoes clicking rapidly across the floorboards. Celia followed him, her face buried in her hands, sobbing with a sound that didn't look like it belonged in a magazine at all. I shut the heavy oak door, turned the deadbolt until it clicked into place with a solid, satisfying thud, and walked back into my kitchen. The house was completely quiet again. The radiator in the corner let out a long, warm hiss, and Barnaby the cat stretched his paws out, completely unbothered by the storm that had just passed through the room. I sat back down at the table, pulled the Boston Globe crossword puzzle toward me, and picked up my pencil. I looked at the clue again. 8-letter word for betrayal. I smiled, pressed the lead down against the paper, and firmly wrote out the letters Celias. It didn't fit the squares, of course, but it solved the problem beautifully.
If you've spent your life building something with your own 2 hands, don't ever let someone tell you you're too old to defend it. When grown children start using words like "for your own good," you'd better start looking at what papers they're hiding behind their backs. Tell me in the comments below, what would you do if your own child tried to turn you into a charity case for internet clout? I'm Miriam Alden. I'm 76 years old, and I'm still holding the ledger.